When you're pawning, there are a lot of things that could go wrong. These deals, like wrongly estimating the worth of a rare sports item and buying stolen goods without knowing it, almost wiped out the shop's earnings. How did these risky purchases almost put the Pawn Stars out of business? The shop had been through a lot of ups and downs with deals before a customer came in with what seemed like a dream come true for anyone who collects sports souvenirs. A Willie Mays outfit from 1961. The customer thought he was holding a piece of baseball history that would fetch him a small wealth. He was excited and nostalgic at the same time. The outfit, complete with pants that matched, had been stored away in his closet for many years. It had been passed down from an uncle who had loved it since the late 1960s. Rick was always the one to be careful with expensive things, so he knew this could be a big win or a mistake that would cost a lot of money. The outfit looked so clean that it was almost too clean. There were no stains or frayed edges that would have shown that it had been to a big league baseball game. The customer was sure that the outfit was real, but he couldn't show any proof to support his claim. Even though he didn't have proof, Rick knew how important it was. Rick knew he could lose a lot of money, so he called in a professional to figure out what was going on. The room became tense as the expert looked at the shirt. It was all about the details. It was important that the tags, the stitching, and the cloth were all perfect. The expert confirmed that it was, in fact, a Spalding jersey from the right time period with Willie Mays' name and the number 24 stitched nicely into the waistband. The twist came next. It looked like it was a game-issued outfit because it didn't have much wear and tear. A small but important change. Everything changed when I learned this. The uniform was still valuable, but it wasn't the hidden gem the customer had hoped for. The expert thought it was worth between $35,000 and $40,000 and $40,000, which is a lot less than a real game-worn shirt. But the customer didn't give up and asked for $45,000. Rick wasn't going to give that much money without more guarantees. He said that $20,000 was enough. A number that showed how unclear the deal was felt. The talks turned into a fight of wills. The customer tried to get the price raised, but Rick wouldn't give in. He didn't want to take a chance with the shop's money. Finally, they came to an agreement on $31,000, which made both sides uncomfortable. It became clear what was really going on as the customer left with his check. Rick knew he was taking a measured risk, but he was still afraid of losing. That risk didn't pay off, it turned out. The outfit sold for a lot less than people thought it would at auction. In an instant, more than a third of the investment was gone. It turned out that the shirt had never even belonged to Willie Mays, which was the real shocker. It was only a sample, and it was worth only a few $1,000s. Rick could only shake his head at how close it came to happening. To remember you that even the best deals can go bad in the blink of an eye in the pawn business. A guitar with a famous past was part of the next deal that almost shut down the pawn shop. When Rick was done with the Willie Mays outfit, Vic Flick, a famous studio musician who had worked with some of the biggest names in music history, called him. Flick brought in his 1961 Fender Stratocaster guitar, which had been on a lot of hit songs and popular movie soundtracks like the James Bond theme. Rick was aware of how valuable a 1961 Fender Stratocaster was. Collectors are very interested in these guitars, but this one was worth more than just its age and name. It had a long history. Flick said that he had used it on many songs with acts like the Beatles and Tom Jones. The guitar's link to such important events in music history gave it a unique background that could make its price go up even more. Flick wanted to get $70,000 for the guitar, which was a fair price given its long past and the fair value of the Fender itself. To be safe, Rick, however, called in a professional to check how much it was worth. The pro said that the guitar really was an Olympic white 1961 Fender Stratocaster, which is a model that could fetch around $35,000. The expert said that based on its past, it might even fetch $60,000 to $70,000 at auction. Things were tough during the talks. Flick was adamant about his price, and Rick had to think about what the risks were. The guitar had a lot of history, but Rick wasn't sure if Flick's name would be strong enough with collectors to support the high price. They finally decided on $55,000 after some back and forth. This is a big investment for the shop. But this deal turned out to be a bad idea. Things changed, and the guitar was auctioned off in 2014. It only brought $25,000, which is less than half of what Rick paid for it. The loss on this deal was a harsh warning that things can go wrong, even when they are well documented. After the dangerous mistake with Vic Flick's guitar, Chumlee's decision to buy a 1986 Buick Regal was another deal that could have gone badly for the pawn shop. The seller of the car had already put a lot of money into customizing it, such as giving it a new paint job, better seats, and a V8 engine swap. Rick was careful because he knew that old Buick Regals don't usually have much value even if a lot of money is put into them. The seller first asked $2,500, which he thought was a fair price for the work that had been done on the car. In Rick's mind, it was only worth $1,000, so he wasn't sure. But Chumlee couldn't say no to the car's charm. He thought it could be fun, so even though Rick didn't want to, Chumlee offered $2,000. They paid too much for a car that wasn't worth nearly as much on the open market. It didn't stop Chumlee from being excited. He took the car to get more work done, which added $3,000 to the changes. This choice made it even more likely that the deal would go bad. Chumlee loved his new lowrider, but Rick wasn't as happy with it. Even with the changes, the car was still just a 1986 Buick Regal, and those models were never known to hold up well. In the end, Chumlee paid $5,000 for the car, which is a lot of money for something that probably wouldn't sell for more than $2,000. The deal was a good example of how excitement can make it hard to think clearly, which can lead to bad financial choices. Soon after the risky purchase in the Buick Regal, there was another deal involving a strange piece of art called the Grandpa Cyclops print that almost went wrong. Mark Mothersbaugh, the founder of the band Devo, made this limited edition piece of art. It caught Rick's eye because of its unique style and the fact that he knew who made it. After buying the painting at a thrift store for only $15, the person selling it went to the pawn shop hoping to make a lot of money. She asked for $1,500, a price that seemed high for something so unique. As part of Mothersbaugh's Beautiful Mutant series, the print had a picture that had been digitally changed to make it look symmetrical and almost creepy. The seller said that there were only 50 of these pictures made, and she thought that the high price was fair because of how rare it was and how well known the artist was. Rick was interested in the picture but wasn't sure how much it was worth, so he asked an art expert to look it over. The specialist confirmed that the print was in fact one of a limited edition and said that Mothersbaugh was known for being both a musician and a busy modern artist. It was worth between $800 and $1,000, which was a lot less than what the seller wanted, but still enough to make a profit. Rick was able to buy the picture for $625 after some haggling. He thought it would look good in his collection of strange art. That being said, Rick didn't know at the time that the seller had only paid $15 for the print, which made her the real winner. Rick was sure he could make a small profit, but the gap was much smaller than he thought it would be, especially since the art only appealed to a small group of people. Even though it wasn't a terrible buy, this deal showed that even professional pawnshop owners can be tricked. After the interesting risk with the Grandpa Cyclops picture, there was a chance of making another deal that would cost a lot more. In this case, it was a book that Shoeless Joe Jackson had signed. Jackson is one of the most famous and hated baseball players of all time. Jackson's signature is famous for two reasons. First, it is very hard to find, and second, it has something to do with the 1919 Black Sox incident. Jackson couldn't read or write and was often embarrassed by how badly he wrote, so he rarely signed anything himself. This made any real autograph a possible gold mine. Rick was interested right away when the seller came into the pawn shop with the book. It is well known how rare it is to find a Shoeless Joe Jackson autograph, and the seller had proof that the signature was real. This was enough to make Rick do something dangerous. Rick chose to believe the certificate and the seller's word instead of getting a professional to check the signature. It looked like the possible payoff was too good to pass up, even if it meant taking a big risk. The seller started the negotiations by asking for $30,000. This price showed how valuable the seller thought the autograph was. Rick offered $10,000 even though he knew there were risks because he knew sports items can be very easily faked. The seller was eager to sell the book and knew it had a lot of promise. They negotiated a price of up to $13,000, which Rick agreed to pay. There was a lot of tension in the shop. Rick was putting a lot of money on this being a real piece of history. But the deal quickly turned from exciting to terrible. After the purchase, more research showed that the signature was most likely not real. That fake certificate didn't mean anything, and the book, which was once thought to be an important part of sports history, was now just another costly mistake. This deal, which had both the draw of rare history and the shadow of fraud, cost a lot of money and taught us how dangerous the pawn business can be. Even the most seasoned professionals can be swayed by a chance that seems like it will only come around once. However, the real value lies in the lesson learned. After what happened with the Joe Jackson book without shoes, you might think Rick would be more careful. But he had made the same mistake with a claimed Wells Fargo safe just one season before. In the episode called Corey's Big Play, a seller came into the shop with what looked like a piece of Wild West history in old Wells Fargo safe and some ball and chain locks. The seller said the chains came from Folsom and Yuma prisons. It is famous for holding some of the worst criminals in history. Rick knew right away that something wasn't right. The cuffs and chains didn't look right. In the 1800s, this method of welding wasn't used, but he saw that the chains were arc soldered. He thought the balls were fake because they had jail names on them, which was a big red flag. In the past, no prison would have changed their tools in that way. Rick quickly thought the shackles were fakes, but the strongbox could still be useful. The strongbox looked real enough. It was strong, with cast iron handles. Rick chose to take a chance on the box, even though it came with fake things. He finally agreed to pay $450 because he thought he might be getting a piece of Wells Fargo history. The seller was happy to leave, and Rick felt like he had just made a good deal. Things quickly changed, though, when Rick called in an expert to look at the strongbox. The expert looked at the box and then dropped the bomb. Not at all like a Wells Fargo safe deposit box, it wasn't even a real old thing. The box was a work of pure fancy, something new that was made to look like something old. The box's lock was also not one that Wells Fargo has ever used. Rick had been lied to. Even though he knew something wasn't right at first, he let his joy get the best of him. That $450 he spent was now going into a well-made but fake piece of history. When a one-person submarine was brought in, the shop couldn't say no to the strange and odd. You'd think they wouldn't bring in anything strange after what happened with the Wells Fargo safe. The seller said they got the sub for free from someone who just wanted to get rid of it. The story behind this is just as strange as the thing itself. Even with this red flag, Rick couldn't help but be interested in the chance of turning something so uncommon. Even though the sub was broken and missing parts, Rick was still interested in it. While the seller had first asked for $25,000, she was quickly ready to lower the price, which made Rick even more suspicious. He knew the sub was in bad shape and would cost a lot to fix up, but the money that could be made if it could be fixed was tempting. Rick offered $2,000, and after some short talks, they agreed on $3,000. Rick thought this was a great deal. Rick didn't know that things were about to get worse with this deal. Soon after the buy, a lawyer working for a wealthy client in California saw the episode and knew the submarine. It had been stolen from the boat of his client 5 years before. The sub wasn't just a strange find, it had been stolen. The sub was quickly given back to its original owner. Rick lost $3,000 and had nothing to show for it, but he learned how to be careful. As the submarine was being towed away, Chumlee couldn't help but jab. "Okay, Rick, you now know, before you buy it again, ask if it's been stolen." Rick and his team were pulled into another high-stakes deal soon after the mistake they made with the stolen submarine. In this case, it was an old car that was both a machine and a work of art. A seller brought in a 1932 Ford Model B Roadster that had been carefully rebuilt over the course of 3 years. Each part had been carefully picked out, but none of them were from 1932. The moment Rick and Corey saw the car, it was clear that it was not like any other car they had seen. It caught people's eyes with its shiny steel body, new paint, and strong engine. But as Rick looked more closely at the car, the truth became clear. This car looked more like a current copy than a real old one. It didn't have the original parts that would have made it a classic. Instead, extra parts were added. Rick was aware that this was a problem, even though the car looked great. The seller told the buyer straight out that they had put $140,000 into the building, with $80,000 for parts and the rest for work. He wanted $70,000, which was a lot of money for something that didn't have any original parts. Rick didn't want to pay too much, so he called Danny, an expert on handmade cars, to get a second opinion. Danny confirmed what Rick already thought. Even though it was well made, the car wasn't a real 1932 Ford. This was more of a high-end hot rod. It was expensive, but not as much as a classic car that has never been used. Danny thought it was worth between $70,000 and $75,000 on the market, so Rick wouldn't make much money if he bought it. The seller was set on his price, though, because he knew how hard he had worked on it. Rick and the seller talked back and forth, with Rick trying to negotiate a lower price so that he could still make money. The seller wouldn't move much, and in the end, they agreed on $68,250, which Rick thought was a high price. It cost a lot of money to store a beautiful car that might not sell for a while. Even though it meant taking on more risk than normal, Rick couldn't say no to the allure of owning such a well-made machine. Even though Rick told him not to, Corey couldn't help but take the Roadster for a spin once the deal was done. The car was beautiful, but it was too small for me. It was clear that it was made for someone who cared more about speed than comfort. While Corey's ride through the streets may have been fun, it also showed how risky this buy was. Rick couldn't help but laugh at how funny it was when he found out. He spent a lot of money on a beautiful car that he thought might be too hard to sell.